Hey ballerinas, welcome back to Reformation Rambles, a series where I tell you all about the history of the European Reformation. Today we're talking about Francois Valois, or Francis I. Please excuse my French pronunciation through all of this. I scraped a C in GCSE French. I have not been to France since. I'm going to put the words up on the screen. Apologies to any French speakers for butchering your language. So, Francis was born in 1494 to Charles, Count of Angoulême and Louise of Savoy. He was born in the Chateau of Cognac, and when he was born he wasn't really expected to take the throne. His predecessor, Louis XII, when he was born was quite young and everyone just kind of assumed he'd have children. And he did, he had one daughter, but thanks to Salic law women couldn't take the throne. So Francis married his daughter. So in 1515 he took the throne. He'd be king until his death in 1547. And a lot happened during that time, so let's get into it with chapter 1, Patron of the Arts. So the Reformation took place sort of parallel to the Renaissance. It was an artistic boom that the world has never really let go of. And Francis was known for bringing what we now know of as the biggest Italian Renaissance artist to France and sort of setting off the French Renaissance. You ever wondered why the Mona Lisa's in France? Well, Francis contacted emerging artist Leonardo da Vinci and was like, hey, you want to come hang in France? And he did, and that's why the Mona Lisa is still in France to this day. He also developed and promoted a really standardised French language, and he made moves to have it replace Latin as the national language of France. As part of this, he opened the Collège des Trois Langues, also known as the Collège Royale, where they taught Greek, Hebrew and Aramaic. And later, Jean Postel would take over the college and start teaching Arabic as well. There's something funny about it originally being called the University of Three Languages and then teaching 4 languages. It was actually the first place in Europe to promote Arabic studies of any form. So from 1539 he had French used in all sort of administrative capacities within the government, French being used as the national language. So Francis came to be known as the Père et Restaurateur des Lettres, or father and restorer of letters. Now, he was also an actual poet and an avid reader. Like with the artist, he'd support and encourage up-and-coming writers to come to France and write there. He also hired Jean Boudet as chief librarian. He had agents all across Italy who would locate rare manuscripts and pieces of art for him. Now, this wasn't that uncommon in rulers of the time. It was sort of a showy thing. Look how much money I have this thing and you can't get it, ha ha ha. But unlike a lot of rulers of the time, it looks like Francis actually read these. He actually was just passionate about the arts. It wasn't all for show, like with most rulers of the time. He also had a large input into now famed French architecture. He had the Louvre rebuilt. He renovated numerous castles. His largest project was on the Chateau de Fontainebleau, which became the residence of his mistress and Duchess of Tampere. And it has a fountain that they mixed wine and water with. Fun fact. Of course, this is Reformation Rambles, and his life was not spent simply loving the arts and pushing for them in France. So let's move on to part 2. Roi Chevalier, or the Night King. This became one of Francis's best known nicknames, and unlike his other nickname, Francois au Grand Nez, or Francis Big Nose, this one was not a personal insult, but in reference to his ongoing conflicts with Charles V of Spain, of which he was very personally involved in. It should be noted he didn't really start any new conflicts in his time as king. Most of this was just stuff that was carried on from his predecessors, and the most notable of these is the Italian Wars. Now, this began the year Francis was born, 1494, and would continue well past his death until 1559. Not that he was an unwilling participant in any of these, let's be real. Essentially, the Italian Wars consist of lots of smaller groups of wars. Maybe I'll make a full video about that at some point, but for now, I'm just going to cover the ones that are particularly relevant. If you are interested in hearing more about the Italian wars, let me know in the description and I will deign to actually make a video on them in full, because they are very interesting. But primarily these wars did take place between Francis and Charles, to the point where in some books you'll see them referred to as the Habsburg-Valois conflict. Charles Habsburg was Francis's sworn enemy, and the pair had a very intense personal rivalry. Charles even challenged Francis to one-on-one combat multiple times. There's definitely enemies to lovers fic on AO3, isn't there? Only the first part of that actually happened. They never... yeah, you guys know this. Moving on. Charles's lands, which we talk about in this video, basically surrounded Francis's, so it was sort of a constant threat. But Francis would have a lot of temporary victories, particularly in the period commonly known as Francis's First Italian War. I know, it's not that imaginative, but still. This covers sort of 1515 to 1516, and during this time Francis would also have the combined forces of the Papal States and the Old Swiss Confederacy. This would lead to a victory that would allow Francis to take control of Milan. But this didn't last. He'd lose Milan in the period generally known as the 4 Years' War, from 1521 to 1526. Now he'd lose it to a combination of Charles's forces, but also the people of Milan itself started revolting, and that had a huge impact on his ability to maintain power there. His main and most remembered loss was at the Battle of Pavia in 1525, where his horse was injured and he was captured by Charles's men. He would then be held captive in Madrid. Whilst there he wrote the following to his mother: "Of all things nothing remains to me but honour and life, which is safe." And he was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Madrid. This surrendered all French claim to Naples and Milan, and recognised the independence of the state of Burgundy that had been under French rule since 1477. 2 months later he was allowed to return to France, but he had to sort of give them his 2 sons, called Francis and Henry. He would later claim that the agreement was not legitimate because 1, he was clearly forced to sign it under duress, and 2, the fact that they had claimed his sons when he left meant they did not trust his words. Now, part of why he felt he could contest the Treaty of Madrid was a newfound alliance with England. He tried to seek this alliance way back in 1520 at the Field of Cloth of Gold, which is where he and the King of England at the time, Henry VIII, in Calais. This was English land at the time. I know it's France now, but borders have shifted in the past 500 years, shocker. It was just this ridiculous, lavish event. It was peak rich people doing stupid shit. Each of them were trying to outdo each other with music and feasts and jousting and a lot of gold. It was a very expensive event. They were diplomatic. The whole thing was structured around either of them having a particular advantage. Their sort of sites were made to be on level ground, and whilst Calais was English land at the time, it was very close to the French border, and they weren't allowed to joust each other. Apparently Francis was particularly delighted by Henry VIII's, he had 2 monkeys in gold leaf. They'd been given by the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Selim I, and apparently Francis was just delighted by these creatures. I'm guessing 1500 Europe, you don't see many monkeys, so he loved them. He just thought they were the funniest creatures in the world. That's not particularly relevant to anything, I just love that fact, wanted to throw it in somewhere. Now, after this alliance, Francis's mum and Charles's aunt would gather together and eventually come to the Peace of the Ladies, which was sort of a toned down version of the Treaty of Milan, and this was agreed upon in 1529. Now, the War of the League of Cognac, I told you it was made up of lots of little wars, which covered sort of 1526 to 1530, was quite a big success for Francis. He worked with Pope Clement VII and Venice as a whole, essentially remove imperial power from Italy, the imperial power being Charles's, where he owned. Later in 1534 he'd try and form an alliance with the Landgrave of Hesse. Well, he would form an alliance with the Landgrave of Hesse. It would be a secretive one, and that was sort of him trying to capitalise on the rise of Protestantism and how that was impacting Charles in the Holy Roman Empire. He also had a lot of support from the Ottoman Empire. which proved very beneficial to his war efforts. More on that soon. Firstly, part 3, new land for the taking. So after he failed to become Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, Francis felt shut out of a lot of the things that Charles was able to do. So by papal descent, Spain was allowed to take over a lot of the New World and nowhere else was. It's not the most relatable problem, is it? In Francis's own words, I would very much like to see the clause of Adam's will, by which I should be denied my share of the world. Anyway, Francis would eventually respond by being the ruler who sort of sent people off for early French exploration of the New World with people like Jacques Cartier. He very much paved the way for French colonialism. And not just in the Americas. So he did develop contacts in the New World, but he also started to develop contacts in East Asia. He developed close contact with the Ottoman Empire, which would allow a French Mediterranean trade, like they hadn't had for a long while. In 1524, an explorer, Vercisano, over to the New World and claimed modern-day New York for France. At the time it was referred to as New Angoulême. In 1531 he would send Jonathan, who would set up a French trading post in Brazil, and in 1534 Francis would send Cartier famously to Quebec, essentially instructing him to find islands full of gold. At this time the Americas were very much used as Europe's gold mine. I'm not saying it's okay, but that is literally what happened. So now France was the first European country to establish formal relations with the Ottoman Empire, as well as the first to teach in Arabic. Now this has been called the first non-ideological alliance of its kind between a Christian and non-Christian empire, and Christian countries thought it was scandalous. People called it a sacrilegious union, an impious alliance, but it served both parties really well. And so it lasted for quite a long time in spite of all of this drama. I should mention that whilst Francis sent the first sort of French explorers to East Asia, that's literally all he did. He began them exploring over there. It wasn't anything more than that. Whereas in the New World, actual movements towards French colonialism were made. Which takes us to part 4. Reform is fine until it's not. Now for an episode of Reformation Rambles, I have barely mentioned the Reformation. And that's because for the early part of Francis's reign, he didn't care. For a European guy in the 1500s, Francis actually seems quite ahead of his time on a lot of things, and this seems to be one of them. His rule saw Protestantism and humanism spread across the continent, and unlike in the Holy Roman Empire where there was conflict and all-out war quite rapidly, Francis was pretty tolerant of Protestantism. We shouldn't understate that it was a useful political tool for him against Charles, who was struggling with sort of a splintering Holy Roman Empire, and how that helped him. That's probably a large factor in why he was so tolerant of it. It's also interesting to note just in general, but he wasn't just like astoundingly tolerant. But he didn't deign to persecute Protestants until the day of the placards. In 1534 people awoke to notices on the streets of mainly Paris, but some other French cities as well, essentially denouncing Catholicism, and one appeared on Francis's own bedroom door. Now how they did that, no one knows. Obviously there was a lot of sort of security and things by the king's room, but one of these placards did appear on his door. And from that moment on, Francis saw Protestantism as a personal threat. So Protestants were arrested and executed. Printing of Protestant books was banned, effectively censoring these texts. And reformers, like for example John Calvin, were banished. If you want to know more about John Calvin, I'll put a video link up there. I did a video about him last year. As a result of these very sudden, quite harsh policies, thousands were executed and tens of thousands were left homeless. But that's not how Francis is remembered. So let's talk about death and legacy. It's debated whether Francis died of a disease of the urinary ducts or of syphilis. He had many mistresses as well as his 2 wives, and France mainly remembers him as an irresponsible playboy who disgraced France at Pavia. Even though in his own time he was actually seen as a great king, We don't know for sure why there's been this shift, but almost certainly some of it is down to anti-royalist sentiment following the French Revolution, and Francis's grave was one of many that was desecrated following the revolution. So that's the story of Francis Valois, a story of him fighting his sworn enemy, discovering the world, and not being remembered fondly by the country he did it all for. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please give me a cheeky like and subscribe. If I touched on anything in this video you'd like to hear more about, do let me know in the comments. Do you think Francis deserves his reputation? Let me know, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye! Frankie, please, I'm trying to film. Frankie, how are you still shitting?